Mr. Barton.
Mr. Chairman, I have several amendments at the desk, but I know we're getting short on time. I would like to bring the Barton decoupling amendment that deals with Section 6001.
Mr. Chairman, I reserve a point of order.
The clerk will report the amendment. The gentlelady from Colorado reserves a point of order on the amendment.
Amendment to the committee print offered by Mr. Barton. In Section 6001A, strike, each of the following will occur,
Mr.
and
Chairman,
all
I
that
would
follows through to the state.
ask unanimous consent the amendment be considered as read.
Without objection, that will be the order. Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, this is probably, at least in my opinion, the most important consumer protection amendment in this markup. Under the bill as it's currently constructed, for the first time, we would give a federal authority, if the governor of the state approved, to what is called decouple the prices our consumers, both retail, residential, and commercial, pay for their electricity. You would actually put into place, at least potentially, a revenue guarantee for electricity generators. Now, because of that, the Edison Electric Institute, who I have a very positive relationship with, does support the base tax. They want a revenue guarantee, and I guess I can say I don't blame them. But we represent, we the members of this committee in the House of Representatives, we represent the consumers, the payers of these rates, and the last thing in the world I would think we want to do is do all these great energy efficiency ideas and actually get people consuming less electricity and then not have their costs go down. Because if the governor of the state approves, it requires that the regulatory body, if it's regulated in a state that has a PUC, has to put in place a rate that guarantees the same revenue to the electricity generator. Now, I'm not opposed to my friends in the utility sector making a profit. I'm not opposed to them, doing all these things that they've done so well for so long. But I don't think we want to put in place in federal law a revenue guarantee for the utility companies of America. I think we should be protecting the consumers, the people that pay the electricity cost, and if we just adopt the Barton Amendment, then we leave the status quo. If you have a state that has a regulated market, and for some reason the utilities in that state need more revenue, they go to the PUC and make their case, and they get a higher rate if the PUC agrees. If you're in a state like Texas where we have a deregulated market, the utility sector in our state can try to get more market share. They can try to become more cost efficient. They can build new power plants that are more energy efficient. They have all kinds of things they can do to try to maintain their revenue in the marketplace. But in a deregulated state like Texas, they're not guaranteed a specific price. This bill gives the authority for the first time for a utility to decouple what it's charging from what people are consuming. And this is kind of a simple example, but if my home is in a regulated state and I'm paying $200 a month for electricity and I cut my electricity consumption in half, if the base tax becomes law and the governor of that state approves, then I still pay $200, even though I'm using half as much electricity. And I think that's wrong. And I want to put into the record, Mr. Chairman, letters that you and I have received from the American Forest Paper Association, the Industrial Energy Consumers of America, and the National Association of Regulatory Commissioners, Utility Commissioners. That letter went to Mr. Reid, Mrs. Pelosi, Mr. Boehner, and Mr. McConnell that strongly support the Barton Amendment and strongly oppose the base text of the bill. I would ask unanimous consent to
Chairman,
those
I'll
letters.
withdraw my
Jim-
reservation.
Without objection, the
Will the
letters will
gentleman
be added to the record. Further, without objection, the gentlelady from Colorado's reservation of a point of order
I
will
have-
be withdrawn.
Mr. Chairman, I would yield
Well,
to
if the
Mr.
gentleman will
Markup.
yield, I would just say, Ms. Harmon and I introduced legislation that was enacted last year on light bulbs. And part of it was consumers were going to save energy and save money by changing to from the old inefficient incandescent bulbs. And now there's no incentive to do that because they're going to use less electricity, yet they're going to pay the same rate. If you want meters that are smart meters, so that people are encouraged to use electricity after midnight or so, like you can on your appliances, washing dishes, clothes, there's no incentive to do that. So if you're for conservation and you're for consumers trying to save energy, the last thing we should do is empower the governor to be able to charge the same amount despite that customer using many, many kilowatts, maybe thousands of kilowatts less because they've moved on to more energy efficient appliances and light bulbs. And I would like to think that the status quo ought to stay there. We shouldn't allow other states to embark on a scheme that will in fact raise utility prices for anyone who takes advantage of more energy efficient devices, whether they be lighting, appliances, who knows what it might be. And I yield back my time.
Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman. May I speak on the amendment?
Who seeks recognition? Well, we have to go to this side.
No one's, oh,
This
now
side.
I have.
Chairman,
Mr. Inslee. And then we'll-
thank you. The adoption of this amendment would remove probably what I believe in the long run will be the single most effective thing for creating jobs in energy efficiency and giving consumers an opportunity to actually have less cost over the long run in their utility bill for 4 reasons. Decoupling, which this amendment would simply gut in the bill, has been the single best policy in America, proven without question, to reduce the amount of wastage of energy by Americans. And I'll tell you why I say that. California, 20 years ago, the average California used the same amount of electricity as everybody else in the country. Then they adopted a thing called decoupling. And decoupling simply is a common sense procedure which allows utilities to sell efficiency services as well as electrons. Once we free utilities to sell insulation services, energy audit services, energy efficient light bulbs, that Fred did such a great job with Jane Harmon last year, once we give them that ability to make money selling energy efficiencies, you know what they do? They sell energy efficiency services. As a result of that single change, the average American today uses 40% more electricity per capita than they did 20 years ago. Guess what the people in California do? They use no more electricity than they did 20 years ago. And you know what? They've still got hot tubs. They're still living that lifestyle of California, and they still got an economy. This is a spectacularly successful program that we need to implement. Second, even though it is possible, and I say possible, even if it is possible that a rate go up for a unit of energy, it doesn't mean your monthly bill goes up. Because if you use less electricity and still have a hot tub, even if the rate goes up, you don't have more in your monthly bill. You just waste less energy and you save the economy. Second point. Third, decoupling creates jobs. We are creating a whole new green-collar industry of people to go out, do an energy audit, put in insulation, change windows, change doors, put in energy-efficient lighting, heating, and air conditioning systems. We're creating thousands of jobs because of the adoption of this policy. Fourth, and this is important, I think. This goes back to what Barack Obama's sort of central theme of his inauguration. If we're going to create a new economy in this country around clean energy, and if we're going to tame this beast of global warming, we can't have any red state America, and we can't have any blue state America, and we can't have any energy efficient America, and we can't have any energy inefficient America. We got to have one America that adopts the tools that have been proven to be effective in the creation of these new green-collar jobs. And for us to use, we should not put down the single most effective tool that Americans have proved is successful so we can move forward together in America. I think it's entirely consistent with this fundamental message of the inaugural address. So I want to, and by the way, I should note, I have an amendment that would have even a stronger provision that would say we ought to condition the receipt of this $200 billion we're giving states on actually moving forward on decoupling and building codes. So I'd yield Mr. Markey.
I thank the gentleman very much. The gentleman has put his finger on the essence of this provision and why it's so important. My mother always said to me, always try to work smarter, not harder. And that was before she would say that she was going to donate my brain to Harvard Medical School as a completely unused human organ. Now, here, what we've seen is decades and decades where everyone believed that the increase in the gross domestic product was tied to an increase per economic unit in the amount of energy we consumed. What we've learned over time is that if you create the incentives to consume less energy, then there is better investment by consumers, business and individual, in the appliances, in the devices which people use. And the more efficient they are is the less electricity. But under this system, the utility still makes money. They actually start to get rewarded for actually selling less electricity. That's why Duke Power, that's why other utilities are moving to this model, because this is the way that the future helps the utility to make money, even as they're selling less electricity, because they're partnering with the consumer. So this decoupling provision, as the gentleman pointed out, is central to the long-term increase in the efficiency, the devices, the jobs which are created, and less consumption of electricity in our society. And I urge an aye vote for the gentleman, a no vote on this amendment.
The gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Shimkin.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, thank you. And I'll be brief. I've always focused on the increased cost to the individual consumer. I think in discussion with Mr. Markey's comment, the best way for people to move to energy efficiency is for them to reap the benefits of lower cost. I'm not a big government guy. I don't want the state to do that for me. I don't want the national government to me. I want to get the benefits. If I put new windows in my house and my heating bills will go down, I want to have those benefits. And so I'm not a believer yet on this decoupling. But I will tell you, in Illinois, when we deregulated the electricity market, electricity prices went sky high. There was a public revolt that almost took down, hopefully they should have taken down our government, but our government sustained itself. And but I will tell you, if the people in my electricity market find out that they are using less but paying the same or paying more, we will be held accountable. The great thing about what happened in Illinois was that the Public Utility Commission, which represents the ratepayers in the state of Illinois, could intervene and protect the consumer from excessive costs. This amendment destroys the ability of the State Public Utility Commission to protect the ratepayer. So I support the amendment. I would yield to my ranking member.
I want to ask Mr. Inslee or Mr. Markey, if they're the great proponents of this part of the text, how you get more efficiency and less consumption if the people that make the investment to do it see their costs remain the same in what they pay out of pocket because they raise the rate per kilowatt. I want to understand that. Decoupling means I can use less, but I still pay the same.
Right. Let me, if you'll take for a moment. Does somebody have the slide? I had a slide earlier. Is the staff, can they put that slide up again for a moment? Because there's a really good answer. That's a really good question. And there's a slide I want to show you from a company called McKinsey Company that's evaluated all of the options we have available to us.
Well, while we're finding the slide, just give me a layman.
Yeah, okay, the layman's answer to that is that when we pay for something, we pay for warmth, not necessarily watts. We don't care about watts. We care about warmth. We care about cooling in the summer and heating in the winter.
If
I can tell my constituents that you can have the same warmth in the winter and the same cooling in the summer for the same amount. Frankly, they don't care how many watts. They just want to know, am I warm and am I not paying more money for it? Now, what this...
Reclaiming my time. If I tell my consumers and my constituents that they can cut their energy use and they still pay out the gazoo, they're going to be outraged. I mean,
You yield for a moment?
somebody has to go out and make that investment.
Would
Somebody
you...
has to put in the solar insulated window panels. Somebody has to put in the highest energy rated insulation. And if you make that investment yourself, see your energy consumption go down in terms of kilowatt hours per month, and yet your cost stays the same because utility just says, okay, you have the right to have a guaranteed revenue stream from the Barton household, regardless of how little electricity the Bartons use.
Yeah.
And that's what decoupling is.
You gentlemen,
Not
yield
a
for...
scientific answer, but that is in the real world what's happening. And if I
Yeah, I just want to make one reference to this chart. This is a chart, and I really encourage people, if you're interested in the subject, to read this. A chart by McKinsey Company. This is, really well-respected Fortune 500 consulting group. If you look at the left of the chart, these are all of the things that save money. Efficiency investments, according to this study by a Fortune 500 analyst, doesn't cost money, it saves money because you make a capital investment and then you reduce your costs over time. And we can take advantage of that savings.
But if I save
through
money,
decoupling.
I want to save money.
You do save money.
No,
You-
the utility's going to take
Reclaiming my time and making sure that the ranking member can have that
Excuse
time.
me.
I mean, look, Jay, I know that's a great chart. I went to MBA school. I can barely understand it, but I can understand it. But I'm talking the real world here. If you use less electricity in your home, you should save money. And if you decouple, you don't.
Gentlemen, yield to me.
I would,
It
Chairman.
seems to me the investment's going to have to be made by the energy company, not by the consumer. So if the energy company now has an incentive to make that investment because they're not going to lose money by not selling more energy, the consumers are happy because they get the benefit of the electricity, but the investments are going to be made.
Mr. Chairman, I have no more time, but I would just end up by saying it's the first time I've heard the Democrats trust an electric utility in my 12 years here.
Mr. Chairman.
Gentlemen's time is up. Could we proceed to the vote because we have so little time? But Ms. Harmon, since you were...
Thank you. Very, very briefly, I think that decoupling is the center of California's energy success. And I just want to say that Mr. Upton and I conspired on a brilliant light bulb efficiency bill. It will be implemented better in California because of decoupling. And the statistics that I have here, yes, I do trust energy companies with respect to this issue, show that that if you do inflation on an inflation-adjusted basis, there was a 1.5% drop in residential customer energy bills per year, and an overall drop of about 17% over the time that California's had decoupling. So I just want to say I strongly agree with Mr. Inslee. I think we should make him an honorary Californian, and I would apply the same request to Mr. Markey, except that he can't speak English. Thank you,
would you
Mr.
yield
Chairman.
just
I
briefly?
yield
Yeah,
back.
would you yield just-
All time has expired. We'll now proceed to a roll call vote on the Barton Amendment.
So we can't move to strike the last word?
We're going to run out of time.
Mr. Chairman, I would ask that we allow one more speaker on each side on this amendment, because I know we agreed to finish up this title by 4:45 approximately, and I know we still have several amendments, but
2 minutes on each side, is that acceptable?
I'll limit it to 2, sure.
Okay.
yeah, but I think this is a big one.
Okay. Mr. Barton, you get to select who gets the 2 minutes on your side.
I leave that to discretion of the chair.
Well, okay, gentleman from Oregon. Who's
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'll go fast, although it says 3:23, so don't look at the clock. I just think this is a huge issue. If I go out as an individual customer and buy the fluorescent bulbs, which I've been doing, they cost a heck of a lot more, but it's advertised, put these in, and you're going to save over 10 years of their life this amount of energy in the average home. You buy new energy-efficient appliances, the Whirlpool appliances, Mr. Upton suggests, then you have you get to save that energy, and all this gets calculated in as an incentive to the consumers to drive the market. Under, as I understand the legislation before us, you are punished as a consumer because you're going to pay the same amount. Now, that may make some people feel warm all over. I think my consumers are going to be hot all over when they find out that they've been had. For the energy savings they've put in, the investments they've made to cut back their energy consumption, and we're going to allow the utilities to guarantee their rate of return by raising the rate. I understand rate. It's sort of like property taxes. You think you got a lower cost, and then they raise the rate, and I pay more or pay the same. If you want to incent the marketplace to change, then you don't punish the customer. And we're going to punish the customer under this base legislation. Every one of you who votes against Mr. Barton's bill is voting to say your customer is going to pay the same regardless of how much energy they reduce.
John, you just for a second.
And no, because I only had 1 minute left. And so I just think this is the most anti-consumer vote, if you vote against Barton, that you could make. And I cannot believe that any of us goes out there and encourages our consumers to save energy by telling them we're going to reward them with the same cost. This is not, and this is the reverse of an incentive system. This is a punishment system, and I just think that Mr. Barton is absolutely right. This needs to be decoupled, and that it is just outrageous that we're going to go down this path. I mean, one of the great incentives of this country is you get to save because you did the right thing for the environment by using less energy. And now we're going to take that away? Not me. I'm supporting Mr. Barton.
Gentleman's time has expired for the last 2 minutes. Mr. Markey, I'm going to yield the 2 minutes, but Mr. Doyle seems, and Mr. Inslee would like some of your 2 minutes.
I think. No, I was going to yield to Mr. Inslee, so that. And I will yield. I thank you. I'm going to read to the committee members a letter to us from the Alliance to Save Energy, the Edison Electric Institute, the American Gas Association, and the Natural Resources Defense Council. EEI, American Gas Association, NRDC. We write to express our strong support for Section 601. This provision will spur significant investments in energy efficiency, which will create jobs, save consumers money, and create new businesses while reducing greenhouse gases. This will create a new set of incentives for utilities to obtain cost recovery for prudent investment and energy efficiency, have an earnings opportunity tied to verified success in delivering cost-effective energy savings, and will not under or over recover authorized fixed costs. Again, this is from the Edison Electric Institute, the American Gas Association, and the NRDC. You're not going to get a broader coalition. I yield to the...
I want my friend Mr. Barton to understand something about decoupling. When you're a consumer in a decoupled utility environment, like we have in many states today, but not all of them, when you pay your electrical bill, you don't get just watts of energy. You also are buying energy services from the utility. So you got to think what you're buying from the utility is now not just watts, which leads to enormous waste because there's no incentive to save then. You are also getting back from the utility a new service, an audit of your home, insulation, clean, efficient windows, non-leaky doors. So even though you might pay the same, you're getting services and watts. That's why this has been so spectacularly well embraced by the communities where it has been implemented, including California, and there's zero political opposition to it in that state. And I'll tell you another reason. Because states have done this, I'll just take California example, they avoided having to build 6 to 10 new coal-fired plants in California with the attendant costs of those new plants. So that's why this makes economic sense. Thank you.
All time has expired. The clerk will call the roll on the Barton amendment.
Mr. Waxman?
No.
Mr. Waxman, no. Mr. Dingell? Mr. Markey?
No.
Mr. Markey, no. Mr. Boucher? Mr. Pallone? Mr. Gordon? Mr. Rush? Ms. Eshoo? Mr. Stupak? Mr. Stupak, no. Mr. Engel? Mr. Green? Mr. Green, no. Ms. DeGette? Ms. DeGette, no. Mrs. Capps? Mrs. Capps, no. Mr. Doyle? Mr. Doyle, no. Ms. Harmon? Ms. Harmon, no. Ms. Schakowsky? Ms. Schakowsky, no. Mr. Gonzalez? Mr. Gonzalez, no. Mr. Inslee? Mr. Inslee, no. Ms. Baldwin? Ms. Baldwin, no. Mr. Ross? Mr. Weiner? Mr. Matheson? Mr. Butterfield? Mr. Butterfield votes no. Mr. Melanson? Mr. Melanson votes no. Mr. Barrow? Mr. Barrow votes no. Mr. Hill? Mr. Hill votes no. Ms. Matsui? Ms. Matsui votes no. Mrs. Christensen? Mrs. Christensen votes no. Ms. Castor? Ms. Castor votes no. Mr. Sarbanes? Mr. Sarbanes votes no. Mr. Murphy of Connecticut? Mr. Murphy of Connecticut votes no. Mr. Space? Mr. McNerney? Mr. McNerney votes no. Ms. Sutton? Ms. Sutton votes no. Mr. Braley? Mr. Braley votes no. Mr. Welch? Mr. Welch votes no. Mr. Barton? Mr. Barton votes aye. Mr. Hall? Mr. Hall votes aye. Mr. Upton? Mr. Upton votes aye. Mr. Stearns? Mr. Stearns votes aye. Mr. Deal? Mr. Deal votes aye. Mr. Whitfield? Mr. Whitfield votes aye. Mr. Shimkus? Mr. Shimkus votes aye. Mr. Shattuck? Mr. Shattuck votes aye. Mr. Blunt? Mr. Blunt votes aye. Mr. Bouyer? Mr. Bouyer votes aye. Mr. Radonovich? Mr. Radonovich votes aye. Mr. Pitts? Mr. Pitts votes aye. Ms. Bono-Mack? Ms. Bono-Mack votes aye. Mr. Walden? Mr. Walden votes aye. Mr. Terry? Mr. Terry votes aye. Mr. Rogers? Mr. Rogers votes aye. Mrs. Myrick? Mr. Sullivan? Mr. Murphy of Pennsylvania? Mr. Murphy of Pennsylvania votes aye. Mr. Burgess? Mr. Burgess votes aye. Ms. Blackburn? Mr. Gingrey? Mr. Gingrey votes aye. Mr. Scalise? Mr. Scalise votes aye. Other members? Yeah. Oh,
Clerk will call the roll of those members who have not yet responded.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Pallone? Mr. Pallone votes no. Mr. Rush? Mr. Rush votes no. Mr. Engel? Mr. Engel votes no. Mr. Weiner? Mr. Weiner votes no. Mr. Dingell? Mr. Dingell votes no. Mr. Ross? Mr. Ross votes no. Ms. Eshoo? Ms. Eshoo votes no.
Have all members responded to the roll call?
Sorry. Mr. Space? Mr. Space votes no.
Any other member wish to respond to the vote? If not, the vote is closed. The clerk will tally the vote and report it.
On that vote, Mr. Chairman, the ayes were 20 and the nays were 33.
20 ayes, 33 noes. The amendment is not agreed to.
Mr. Chairman?
Before we go any further, we have 10 more minutes before the 2-hour time limit is up on this title, and then we have 3 more where we were going to allot 2 hours each, so that would be 6 more hours. Now, obviously, no one wants to be here that long, but we're prepared to be here that long. Let's figure out how many members insist on offering amendments to this print on the energy title.
Mr. Chairman, once we poll the members on how many have amendments, I would hope that we could then agree on a time for each amendment to be fully debated, so much on each time, so that all members get their most important amendments into the record, but yet we not have an amendment where we debate it for another hour so that somebody only gets 30 seconds on their amendment.
Okay. Let's see. A show of hands. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Just the energy part. 5 members have 5 amendments. Then it seems to me that if we're going to do 5 amendments in such a short period of time, let's have 2 on each side, 2 minutes on each side of each amendment. And then I'd also ask further, rather than go to roll call votes on each amendment, that roll call votes be held to be rolled at the end of that period of time.
No, I won't agree to that.
You will not agree to that?
I'm not going to agree
Okay.
to rolling votes. We've never done that in the committee, but I will agree on a time on each amendment. I think that's fair.
Okay, 2 minutes on each side. If members insist on roll call votes, we'll proceed to roll call votes. But members may want to make their points and have the voice vote or even a show of hands rather than take the time for roll call votes. First amendment.
Mr. Chairman?
We have 5 amendments on this title.
On this title.
And we'll have
2 minutes on each side.
4 minutes of debate on each amendment equally divided.
That's right.